Photopea software. Now, Photopea is a free online version of Photoshop, and it's really, really similar to Photoshop to the point where pretty much all of the features are in the same place, the buttons look the same, the tools look the same, so really, really easy to get a hang of if you've used Photoshop before. If you've not used Photoshop before, hopefully this video will just give you some of the bare bones of how to get started in Photopea. So, I've just done a Google search for Photopea. So I'm just going to click the top one. You don't need to make an account, so that's the best thing about this is you don't need to sign up for anything or use your email in any way. It just opens straight away. You can open existing Photoshop files, so if you've got some Photoshop files on your computer, you can open those in here and work straight from them. You can also save it as a Photoshop file, so you can see here you can save it, and then when we go back to college, you could then open it at college. I'm just going to do new project to start with, to show you what it looks like. Now, those of you that have used Photoshop before will be familiar with these different options, these different sort of presets. I'm going to go to print, and that's when you can see your paper sizes. And I generally go for A3, but it's up to you depending on what you're working on. If you want this landscape, you can see it's portrait at the moment. You can change that when you get into the software. You could technically just click that button and it will switch them around for you. So you can see now the width is the long one and the height is the short one, or the opposite way around. If you understand what DPI means, that's resolution, so that's how high quality your final thing is going to be. It always wants to be 300 or more. Sometimes I use 400, sometimes I use 600, but as long as it's 300, that's fine. And then you can have a white or a transparent background. I tend to go transparent, and then if I want to put a colour background in over the top, I can. And I'm just going to call this intro, so you can obviously name your file there. And then I'm going to click create. So that gives us our document. Again, you can see that this system and this sort of format is incredibly familiar to anyone that's used Photoshop. So we've got our selection tool here. This is our toolbar on this side here. These are our panels. So you can see we've got our layers panel here. And then you can open different sort of, so I've got my text here, so my character, setting paragraphs, brushes, things like that. I assume if you go to window, so if I go to window, then I can open different panels. So if I want my swatches or my properties, or if I've lost my layers panel, or I want to see my more in-depth color panel, you can open your panels here. So that's a really nice sort of familiar thing for anyone that uses Photoshop. You'll also see at the top here, we've got transform controls. So for example, if I go to File, so, for example, if I find something that I want to drop on there, so I'm just going to find an image of some sort, so a photograph, and then I'm going to drag that in. And you can see at the top it says it's loading, and then it drops that in there for me. Now, I've got these boxes here, which are my transform controls, so that means I can make it bigger and smaller, and obviously it's stretching at the moment, so I need to hold Shift to make it stay in ratio. Now, if those transform controls aren't showing, I just click tick up here, then I need to, can you see they're not showing now, and when I click it I can't see what's going on, so I need to have that selected at the top, and it's exactly the same as it would be in Photoshop. You can see it's added a new layer for me. We've also got this little lock icon which is up here, so if I want that layer to stay where it is and not move, I can lock it, and then you can see I can't select that or move it. So exactly the same as you would with Photoshop. You've also got the little eye icon, so you can hide your layers. So all of the same sort of functionality as Photoshop. My opacity is here. And then if I drop in another image over the top, so just another random image, and put that over it, you should see that my blend modes here, where it says normal, work in exactly the same way. So very, very familiar, very similar to how they would in Photoshop. So if I want to start doing things like double exposures or getting some interesting layering effects, I can start to use the options in here to get those two things to interact. You can do this with text over photographs. You can do this with two images over the top of each other. You could do this with sort of hand-drawn elements or anything that you've made by hand, patterns or textures, and you could layer those over the top in a similar way, and you can start to layer them together. I'm just going to do undo. Depending on where you are, so I'm on a Mac computer, that is obviously Command Z for me. It might be Control Z for you. So if it's Command on a Mac, it's Control on a PC. And again. Okay, Now, if I wasn't happy with this image and I wanted to change the colour of it or change the brightness or invert it or something like that, same as Photoshop, I go up to Image, I go to my adjustments, and you can see these are all very familiar. So your levels, which help you sort of control the brightness and the contrast in the image, so I can bring my darks darker and bring my lights lighter, and I can play around in the mid zones as well. We've also got our sort of hue saturation, which most of you will be familiar with. So here we've got, if I tick colorize, then I can change the hue and I can actually add a colour on top of my image, so I can colorize. So if something's black and white, maybe a drawing or a sketch or some patterns or some textures, I can then turn those into different colours on here, which is nice and simple to do by using that colorize option. And then you can see if I did maybe the background image, so if I select my background image and do the same thing, and again I'm going to change the hue and I'm going to put the saturation up. Okay, and then you can see when I start to blend these together, we get some more interesting effects and some more interesting colour versions. So nice and easy. If I didn't want to use any sort of layer blend mode effects and I want to get rid of this background, a couple of ways you can do that. So you can see I've got my selection tools here. So I've got my magic wand, which if you've used Photoshop, you'll be familiar with. So I can just select that white background. Now, if I zoom in, you can see it's missed these bits here. So that is this button here which says contiguous, and again you'll have seen that on Photoshop. So if I untick contiguous and then I try again, then you can see it selects everything that is that white colour. Now because I've changed the brightness on my image, you can see it's picking up areas that I don't want it to. I could use these tools here, so you can see I can remove parts, or I could change the tolerance. So the tolerance is how picky it is. So if I take the tolerance down to 5 and then I try again, you can see it's being a lot more picky, so it's not picking up as much. So I could go to something like 2 and try again. Obviously, if that's not working for you, which you can see mine's being a bit fussy, I can re-tick contiguous. I'm going to put that back to sort of 15 where it was, and I can always just hold shift and select those other sections. So it depends how difficult your image is and how many different sort of parts there are. So you can just hold shift and that will allow you to select multiple areas of the image, and then I can press delete. Now to rasterize, normally you would right click your layer and it would open up some options. In Photopea it is slightly different, so you have to go to layer and then rasterize it from there. But again, it does exactly the same thing, so it rasterizes it for you. Then we've got that selection and then we can delete that out. Now obviously it's missed some bits, so I'm going to pick those bits and delete those as well. Command D, and there we go, we deleted out our background. Obviously if I didn't want to delete out the whole background, so you can see my image here, I might not want to delete the whole of the sky out. I might want to use one of my selection tools. So I can either use a rectangular select and just take that part out and then copy and paste it, that part on its own. I could use the ellipse select, so if I wanted to cut a circle out, and again I'm going to hold shift so that I get a perfect circle. And then I could copy and paste that out, and you see it gives it me as a separate layer, and I can put that behind my image and hide the background. I could also use, so you've got here lasso and polygonal lasso. Now lasso is very much like drawing, so if you want to do something that's going to be basically exactly where your mouse goes, you can use lasso. If you want it to be a bit more geometric and a bit more controlled, I would recommend polygonal lasso. And I'm just going to do Command D to get rid of those wriggly lines. So you can see now I've got more control over what bits I want to cut out. And this can be really interesting for going around an image. If you want to cut out a certain area of things, you can zoom in really close and do this properly. But that is our selection tools. You also have magnetic lasso. So if I wanted to, say, cut out my branches here, I do Command D to get rid of those wiggly lines. And then if I use magnetic lasso, you should see that it will start to identify the areas in the image. Now I've zoomed in just so I can see a bit better what it's doing. and you can see these sort of square points that are being added on there. If I click on a regular basis, it will add a square sort of anchor in there for me, and that will make this whole process a lot easier, because you can see if I don't do that, it starts to jump all over the place and go on its own path. So again, you can sort of feather this. So if I wanted to cut that out, but I didn't want it to have these jaggedy edges, I want it to look a little bit more natural, then I could use the feather and put it onto like 5 or 10, and then it would cut it out a little bit better for me. But you can see when I zoom out, actually that's not looking too bad. And I could go around that, and then I could figure out the bit I want to cut out, and then same process, copy and paste it out to put that bit onto a new layer. So it works exactly the same as the selection tools in Photoshop, nice and easy. We've got our magic wand and we've got our different lasso tools. We've obviously got our eraser tool here, we've got our gradient and our paint bucket, we've got all of our sort of image edit tools here, we've got our text tool, so I can draw myself a text box and I can write something in there. Now, one thing you'll notice actually with this is that it doesn't have fonts that we are familiar with. So looking for things like Arial, looking for things like Times New Roman, you won't find them on here. So it has a range of different other fonts in there that all have different names. So you can download fonts, and there is a example on the graphics page. So if you go to playlists and Photopea, I've put a playlist together, and there is an example in there for loading your own fonts in here. I've tried to select as many different things as possible so that you've got loads of sort of different options, but you can load your own fonts in. Best option, I would say, is like you would in Photoshop, is sort of select which ones you want to see. So you can see at the moment it's got all selected. If I unselect all, then I can go through and I can choose whether it's sans serif, whether it's script, whether it's serif, and there should be an option for display. Obviously there's some other ones in here, so novelty and pixel and things like that, but I imagine most people wouldn't want to be using those. They're probably going to be a little bit too out there and a bit, you know, tricky to work with. So you really just want your sans serif, your script, your serif, or possibly some display fonts, but that should help you narrow it down. So if I'm going for sans serif, I want something very modern, then I can narrow it down and I can have a better look at what they look like. So I might go for something chunky like that, or I might go something for a little bit more rounded, or something that feels a little bit more sort of thin and delicate. So there are loads of font options, it's just that they're not fonts that we would be familiar with. Obviously we've got our sort of centre, right aligned, left aligned up here. You can also edit that in the paragraph panel here. You can edit your text further in the sort of character panel here, so we can see the size. You can make it italic and things like that and force it italic. And I think here, if you can see, we've got options that say book. This gives us loads of different options for that font. So we've got a condensed font, which means it's quite squished together. We've got a condensed bold. We've got an extra light, which means super thin. Then we've got your sort of regular. Then we've got our oblique, which is just a fancy word for italic, our bold, and our italic bold. That is the basics of it, really. You can do things like clipping masks in here. You can do lots of different, so you can do clipping masks, raster masks, smart objects, you can group things. There is some animation options in there, and I'll do a thing on that later. But really, you just want to have a look, have a play around. All the filters are still there, sort of like distort. Your liquefy still works on here. All of those kind of filters that you guys are familiar with. You can add guides and snap to and things like that. So all of that stuff that you're familiar with in Photoshop is in Photopea. The only thing I will say is it can be a little bit slow, so bear with it. It does sort of, you know, freeze on you and sort of glitch out. What I would say is, you know, if you've been working on it for more than an hour, what I would just do is save as a Photoshop file and save a version on your computer, so that if it does crash, you've got a version that you can open back up and load back in. So I think it's just really useful to be saving every hour or so. And that is it, basically. So that's the introduction to Photopea. I will do a couple more in-depth versions, but for those of you that are familiar with Photoshop, you should find this a really easy software to use.